Researchers spent more than a decade collecting DNA samples from cemeteries and cave systems in Spain, Denmark, Turkey, Jordan, and the windswept shores of the Black Sea. They extracted genetic material from ancient bones, some of them 7,000 years old, some 10,000, and fed every sequence into one of the most detailed human ancestry databases ever assembled. They were looking for a single mutation, one switch, in one gene. When the results came back, they contradicted something most people, including most scientists, had simply assumed was true. The finding was specific enough that researchers at the University of Copenhagen felt confident making a claim that sounded almost too precise to be real. Every person on Earth today with blue eyes inherited that color from a single common ancestor. Not a tribe, not a population, one person. And what the genetic record revealed about who that person was, where they lived, what they looked like, and how that one mutation traveled across continents over thousands of years, dismantled one of the most quietly persistent assumptions in how people think about ancestry, appearance, and where they come from. Remember this phrase: the switch was turned down, not off. It will mean something very different by the end of this video. If understanding what the largest ancient DNA databases on Earth have actually found about human origins is the kind of science that matters to you, subscribe. This channel covers exactly this kind of research every week for most of recorded history. The assumption has been straightforward. Blue eyes are European. They belong to a particular kind of ancestry, northern, ancient, continuous, and they have always existed in roughly the same geographic populations that carry them today. Textbooks showed it that way. Popular culture reinforced it. And for a long time, the scientific community did not have the tools to challenge it in a meaningful way. That changed in 2008. Professor Hans Eyberg and a team of researchers at the University of Copenhagen published a study in the journal Human Genetics that would quietly rewrite the accepted narrative. The study was methodical. Eyberg's team examined mitochondrial DNA from 155 blue-eyed individuals drawn from Denmark, and then extended the comparison to include blue-eyed subjects from Jordan and Turkey, populations that most people would not immediately associate with the trait. They also analyzed 45 brown-eyed control participants for comparison. The sample was cross-continental by design. The goal was to find a genetic origin point of blue-eye color, not just confirm that it existed. The gene at the center of the investigation was OCA2, a gene located on chromosome 15, responsible for producing a protein called the P protein, which regulates the production of melanin. Melanin is the pigment that gives color to human skin, hair, and eyes. In the context of the iris, the more melanin present, the darker the eye color. Brown eyes carry high concentrations of melanin. Blue eyes, as the day would reveal, carry something far more unexpected. Adjacent to OCA2 sits another gene, HERC2. This gene does not produce pigment itself. Instead, it acts as a regulatory signal. It controls whether OCA2 is switched on at full capacity. Eyberg's team found that blue-eyed individuals across all sample populations shared a single, identical mutation in the HERC2 gene, not similar mutations. Not mutations in the same region. The exact same mutation, at the exact same location in the genome. More than 97% of blue-eyed individuals tested carry what geneticists call the H1 haplotype, a specific inherited genetic signature that traces, without deviation, back to one founding event, one ancestor, one mutation, one moment in human prehistory. What the data showed was this. The mutation responsible for blue eyes did not appear gradually across multiple populations over millions of years. It appeared once, in a single individual, somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, near the northwestern region of the Black Sea. And every blue-eyed person alive on Earth today, roughly 800 million people, descended from that single genetic event. This directly contradicted the assumption that blue eyes were an ancient, multi-origin trait that developed independently in different European populations over deep time. A person living in Copenhagen and a person living in Tehran today might carry the same blue-eyed mutation, inherited from the same individual who lived during the Stone Age, near the coast of sea that most people associate with neither Scandinavia nor the Middle East. Think of it this way. Imagine a large library containing thousands of different editions of the same book. Each edition slightly different, with small variations on every page. That is what brown-eyed genetics look like. Brown-eyed individuals carry enormous variation in the DNA region that controls melanin production in the iris. Each brown-eyed person has their own distinct configuration. Now imagine that instead of thousands of editions, there was only one version, and every copy in existence was printed from the same original plate, with no variation whatsoever. That is what blue-eyed genetics look like. The H1 haplotype is identical across blue-eyed individuals from Denmark, Jordan, Turkey, and Spain. The library has only one edition, and every blue-eyed person on Earth is reading from the same page. Professor Iberg stated it directly in the published study. All blue-eyed individuals are linked to the same ancestor. They have all inherited the same switch at exactly the same spot in their DNA. But the data held one more detail that almost nobody had anticipated. The first known blue-eyed human, the earliest individual in the ancient DNA record who carried this mutation, did not look anything like the image most people carry of a blue-eyed European. In 2014, a team of researchers led by Inigo Olalde at the Institut de Biologia Evolutiva in Barcelona published an analysis in Nature genetic material extracted from a 7,000-year-old skeleton found in a cave system called La Brana in the Leon region of northern Spain. The individual was a Mesolithic hunter-gatherer. His bones had been preserved in the cool, dry dark of the cave for 70 centuries. The DNA analysis confirmed he carried the blue-eye mutation. He was, at the time of the study's publication, the oldest confirmed blue-eyed individual in the ancient genetic record. But that was not the part of the finding that stopped researchers. La Brana Man, as he came to be known, also carried the ancestral alleles for dark skin pigmentation. He had dark, curly hair. He was lactose intolerant. He shared closer genetic affinity with modern sub-Saharan African populations in his skin pigmentation genes than with modern Northern Europeans. He was, in every reconstructible physical sense, a dark-skinned man with blue eyes. 4 years later, in 2018, a team from University College London and the Natural History Museum published a genetic analysis of Cheddar Man, the oldest near-complete human skeleton ever found in Great Britain, dating to approximately 10,000 years ago. Researchers including Ian Barnes and Selena Brace extracted DNA from the skull and sequenced it using cutting-edge ancient DNA technology. The result was the same. Cheddar Man had dark to dark brown skin. He had blue eyes. Here is where the science requires a clarification that changes the entire picture. Blue eyes contain no blue pigment. None at all. The iris of a blue-eyed person has a completely colorless stroma. No melanin, no blue dye, no structural color. The blue appearance is an optical phenomenon, the same physics that makes the sky appear blue. When light enters a melanin-free iris, shorter blue wavelengths scatter back toward the observer. The color exists only in the physics of light. It was never in the biology. The mutation did not create a blue thing. It created an absence, and from that absence, an entire identity would eventually be constructed. But the data were not the only discovery that shifted expectations. By the early 2010s, 2 entirely separate lines of research were closing in on the same conclusion from different directions, and neither team had set out to confirm the other. On one side, population geneticists like Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard Department of Genetics were reconstructing the ancestry of modern Europeans from ancient genomic data. Their 2014 paper in Nature, drawing on ancient DNA from across the continent, identified 3 distinct ancestral populations that contributed to present-day European genetics: Western hunter-gatherers, early European farmers who arrived from Anatolia, and a third wave of migrants from the Eurasian steppe who moved into Europe roughly 5,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. Each wave brought distinct genetic signatures. The steppe migrants, associated with the Yamnaya culture, carried ancestry that would spread across most of Central and Northern Europe. On the other side, archaeological teams in Spain, Britain, Luxembourg, and Scandinavia were recovering ancient skeletal remains and having their pigmentation genetics independently analyzed. Site by site, skeleton by skeleton, a pattern was forming that nobody had predicted. This is where the 2 lines of evidence meet: the genetic record and the archaeological record were pointing in exactly the same direction. Western hunter-gatherers, the people who roamed Europe before farming arrived, had blue eyes far more commonly than they had light skin. In fact, light skin did not become widespread in Europe until thousands of years after blue eyes were already established. The traits that most people associate as a biological package, blue eyes, fair skin, light hair, arrive at completely different times through completely different migrations from completely different ancestral populations. Hold on to that founding population now, that single individual near the Black Sea, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Here is where that detail returns. That individual lived at the precise historical moment when human populations were expanding rapidly due to the Neolithic agricultural revolution. The mutation appeared during one of the greatest migration events in human prehistory. And as those populations moved, first across the Caucasus, then into Anatolia, then into the European interior, they carried one small genetic change in the HERC2 gene with them. The spread was not random. It was carried by people who were moving, farming, and surviving. The question that geneticists have spent considerable time investigating is not just where blue eyes came from, but why they persisted and spread once they appeared. A trait that offers no obvious survival advantage in a purely biological sense still managed to travel from one individual to hundreds of millions of people in fewer than 10,000 years. That is not an accident of genetics. Something was driving it. Professor Iberg addressed this directly. The blue eye mutation, he noted, represents neither a positive nor a negative adaptation in the strict survival sense. It does not increase or reduce the bearer's chance of surviving long enough to reproduce. What it did, and this is the more nuanced finding, was introduce a visible signal of difference into a population where it had never existed before. Researchers at the University of Padova, in a 2025 paper published in Frontiers in Psychology, proposed that sexual selection played a significant role in the trait's persistence. The mechanism is specific. In a population where nearly everyone has dark eyes, a blue-eyed individual is immediately identifiable as genetically distinct. For potential partners seeking visual confirmation of genetic compatibility, particularly in contexts where paternity certainty mattered, a rare, visible, heritable trait provides an unmistakable signal. Blue-eyed individuals in blue-eyed communities could more easily identify their own offspring. The trait became its own selection pressure. There's also a light physics layer to the adaptation. Blue and light-colored eyes are significantly more sensitive to low-light conditions than dark eyes, which contain more melanin acting as a natural filter. In the seasonal darkness of high-latitude northern European winters, where usable daylight can be reduced to a handful of hours, enhanced light sensitivity in the eye offers a genuine perceptual advantage. Dark eyes evolved in high UV equatorial environments as protection against sun damage. Light eyes evolved, or at minimum persisted, in low UV northern environments where that protection was less necessary and enhanced light gathering was more useful. This was not a superior adaptation. It was a local solution to a local problem. The same principle that gave dark-skinned peoples more melanin near the equator applied in reverse as populations moved north. The most significant finding was still to come. The idea that blue eyes were a permanent, defining marker of a specific European people emerged most forcefully in the 19th century, when scholars attempting to classify human populations used observable physical traits, eye color, hair color, skull shape, as proxies for ancestry, intelligence, cultural capacity, and racial category. The scientific methods available at the time could not access the genome. Researchers worked with what they could see, and what they could see, they interpreted through the social frameworks of imperial Europe. The flaw in this approach was not merely methodological, it was directional. The assumption ran from appearance to ancestry, when the actual relationship between the two is far more complicated in both directions. A person's visible traits are not a reliable map to their genetic origins, and the genetic record is not a mirror of the categories that 19th century science built around it. It took over a century and the development of ancient DNA extraction technology, genome-wide association studies, and high-throughput sequencing to correct the record in a verifiable, reproducible way. What the correction revealed is that this is not an isolated error about one trait. It is a structural pattern in how physical appearance has been used as a shorthand for genetic history. Skin color and eye color were assumed to travel together, to belong together, to mean the same thing about ancestry. La Brana man and Cheddar man. Two individuals separated by thousands of kilometers, both demonstrated that the package was never a package at all. Blue eyes were ancient in European hunter-gatherers long before light skin was. Light skin, by contrast, spread primarily with the Neolithic farming populations who arrived from Anatolia. The traits share geography today not because they share a single origin, but because three distinct waves of migration eventually overlapped and admixed in the same continental space. The genetic record does not produce the categories that history tried to create from physical appearance. It produces something far more complicated and far more human. Every trait has its own separate story. Every story leads somewhere unexpected. That pattern held until researchers looked at what all those unexpected stories, taken together, actually meant for every living person on Earth. Return to that single individual, a person living near the Black Sea, 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. A Stone Age human, dark-skinned, dark-haired, probably a hunter-gatherer, in whom a single nucleotide change occurred in the HERC2 gene on chromosome 15. The change did not alter survival. It did not alter intelligence. It did not alter anything about what that person could do, build, think, or feel. It turned down a dimmer switch on a single gene. It reduced melanin in the iris just enough that when light entered the eye and scattered back outward, it arrived at the world as blue. That one change in one person is now carried by approximately 800 million living human beings. It crossed the Caucasus Mountains with Neolithic farmers. It reached Spain in the bones of a dark-skinned man in a cave. It arrived in Britain with hunter-gatherers who walked across a land bridge that no longer exists. It traveled with the Yamnaya across the Eurasian steppe. It crossed oceans, centuries, empires, and migrations. And at every point in its journey, it was simply human, carried by people who were moving, surviving, loving, and reproducing across a world that was constantly in motion. Professor Iberg made one observation that the data supported with unusual clarity. The mutation is neutral. It changes nothing about what a person is. It is, in his words, nature constantly shuffling the human genome, trying out changes, producing variation, creating what looks from the outside like difference and is, from the inside, simply the same biology running a slightly different version of the same code. The research did not just find the origin of a color. It found that the most visible marker of human difference in the modern world traces its entire existence to a single shared ancestor. One person, one moment, one dimmer switch. What the genetic record ultimately confirmed was not a distinction between peoples. It was a connection between all of them. And that connection has been written in the DNA all along.